early church, Sunday was known as the Day of Light. And so it is special when Christmas falls on a Sunday, as it does in 2022. As light dawns this morning, as the children scramble to the tree to see what has appeared, we remember that the sacred comes in the form of surprise sometimes, just as it did when light and life was known anew in the form of a baby in a humble stable. Can we dare to believe that we can know a surprising calm, even in the midst of anxiety because of the inbreaking of this Prince of Peace upon our lives each and every day? How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, "Your God reigns." Listen. Your sentinels lift up their voices. Together they shout for joy. For in plain sight they see the return to the Lord of Zion. Break forth, shout together for joy, you ruins of Jerusalem, for the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. The Logos was with God in the beginning. Everything came into being through the Logos. And without the Logos, nothing came into being. What came into being through the Logos was life, and the life was the light for all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness doesn't extinguish the light. A man named John was sent from God. He came as witness to testify concerning the light, so that through him everyone would believe in the light. He himself wasn't the light, but his mission was to testify concerning the light. The true light that shines on all people was coming into the world. The light was in the world, and the world became into being through the light. But the world didn't recognize the light. The light came to his own people, and his own people didn't welcome him. But those who did welcome him, those who believed in his name, he authorized to become God's children, born not from blood, nor from human desire or passion, but born from God. The Logos became flesh and made a home among us. We have seen his glory, glory like that of a father's only son, full of grace and truth.
There's a text that's a couple hundred years old that has been set to all kinds of music through the centuries. The text, O Magnum Mysterium, was written to be recited at Matins on Christmas Day. Matins is a prayer time that's like 2 a.m. Monastic communities, some monastic communities still keep those hours and pray matins in the middle of the night. I've sung at least 2 settings of these words, this lyric. It was a setting that I sang over a decade ago with the Golden Gate Men's Chorus by a contemporary composer that totally hooked me. The setting by Morton Lordinson is haunting, awe-inspiring, and I experienced it as mystical. It's a challenging piece of music to sing. It has something like 16 different parts. It is lots of close harmonies. It took several months of rehearsing before I really started to like the piece of music. But when I started to like it, I really, really started to like it. So much that I fell in love with it, and that made me want to go and actually understand what the Latin words were that I was singing. And so I went to find a translation. O great mystery and wonderful sacrament, that animals should see the newborn Lord lying in a manger. It struck me as I read those words, at least the way Luke likes to tell the story of the birth of Jesus, the first witnesses to this newborn baby were animals. Animals in the shelter, animals that gave up their feed troughs so Mary and Joseph would have a place for their newborn baby to rest. And realizing this made me wonder why. Why did God choose animals to be the first witnesses to the birth of Jesus? Now, much has been said by preachers, myself included, about the fact that the first humans to receive word about the birth of this baby were shepherds, a class of people marginalized by the hierarchical structure of the time. But before them, it was the animals who were witnesses, the first witnesses to the birth of Jesus. Oh, great mystery and wonderful sacrament. Surprisingly sacred indeed. There's an element of mystery to the opening of John's Gospel too. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. The Logos was with God in the beginning. And I find myself going, well, which was it, John? Was the Logos God, or was the Logos with God? You can't have it both ways, can you? Everything came into being through the Logos, John seems to reply. Without the Logos, nothing came into being. And that sounds a lot like the Logos being God to me, except that he says the Logos was with God twice and only once that the Logos was God. So which is it, John? What came into being through the Logos was life. And the life was the light of the people. Hang on, was it life in general that came into being in the Logos or through the Logos? Or is it the life, as in a specific life, that came into being through the Logos? Because John, later on you said that the Logos became flesh and made home among us. So did you mean that the Logos was in all flesh? Or in a particular piece of flesh, a particular person? Maybe it's not so much mystery in the prologue to John, maybe it's more just confusion. As a general rule, I don't think that there are many of us who, at least in this congregation, who spend a whole lot of time memorizing Scripture. There might be a few of us, however, that have the beginning of John's Gospel memorized because it is so poetic. Those of us that do have it memorized don't have it memorized the way that we just heard it read by Sandy. What we have memorized is in the beginning was the Word, not the Logos. Well, the Logos is the Greek, which is what it was written in, and Logos actually is probably better translated conversation than word. In the beginning was the conversation. The conversation was with God, and the conversation was God. I'm not going to go into why that's a better translation, because last month Pastor Brenda preached an excellent sermon on why that is. Go back and listen to it again if you've forgotten it. Yes, homework on this Christmas day. The thing that's important for today's sermon is that the Logos, being better translated as conversation than word, means that there is a relational dimension to the term. And that's one of the themes that I think John is getting at in this prologue to his gospel. I tend to hear this prologue as pointing to Jesus. It is in Jesus that we Christians claim to have seen God having been infleshed. Franciscan theologian Richard Rohr suggests that Jesus was actually the second incarnation of God. He says the first incarnation was creation itself. He writes, everything that exists in material form is the offspring of some primal source which originally existed only as spirit. This infinite primal source somehow poured itself into finite, visible forms, creating everything from rocks to water, plants, organisms, animals, and human beings. This self-disclosure of whomever you call God into physical creation was the first incarnation. Incarnation being a general term for enfleshment of spirit. Long before the personal second incarnation that Christians believe happened in Jesus. That's the reality we're being pointed to throughout this worship series, that God is present, incarnate in everything. Every moment, every person, every place, every truth, every being. In being itself, God is incarnate. The trick is being open to this reality. The trick is being ready to be surprised by the sacred that is all around us. In our Monday morning Bible study 6 days ago, we talked about what makes something sacred. We tossed around some ideas. When it's truthful, when it's life-giving, when you feel or see God's presence in it, when it's creative, when love is running through it, when it leads us to be sacred, when it moves society closer to justice. We didn't reach a definitive conclusion, though I think all of these may help us identify the sacred somethings in our lives. Thinking more about this idea, I remembered a beautiful moment that I had this past year that I don't think I've talked about in a sermon before. I visited Lassen Volcanic National Park during my sabbatical, and as I was driving down out of the park back towards Reading to spend the night, I had to stop in the middle of the road because about 200 yards in front of me were two black bears, a sow and a cub. And I didn't want to sneak up on them and scare them. I didn't want to rush them because I wanted to look at them as long as possible. But I knew that in just a moment they would be up over the berm on the left side of the road and off into the woods, so I didn't even try to fumble for my camera. I just stopped and took in the moment, surprised by the sacred. As I continued thinking about these amazing moments, no, I think I'm behind on some of my pictures. I had a picture of a black bear that I found online. As I thought about this moment and others, another moment came to mind. In 1990, I was able to go to Berlin for a brief visit and then met up with my dad in Switzerland. It had been a rough couple years. My mom had died 2 years earlier. And so going to Europe and spending some time with my dad was a healing thing for me to do. 1990 Berlin was 9 months after the Berlin Wall came down. So I got to stay with a German shepherd who'd grown up in Berlin, and after I got settled into his apartment, I took a local bus down to Checkpoint Charlie. Only it wasn't there. It had been dismantled about 2 or 3 months earlier. Couldn't find it. I had actually wandered into East Berlin. The country, East and West Germany, hadn't officially unified yet, so technically I was in another country without having gone through passport control. I got a little nervous. My Baedeker's guide had said that, all this stuff about going through Checkpoint Charlie, and it wasn't there. And so I just quietly turned around and walked back into West Berlin. But then on Sunday, a couple days later, the pastor and his girlfriend and I did a little touring of Berlin. And we went around seeing stuff, and it got later in the day, and it was time to get onto the subway system, the U-Bahn in Berlin, to get back to where his apartment was, to a station near his apartment. And so we wandered down into a subway station, and we were standing there on the platform waiting for the next train when he and his girlfriend just sort of wandered off down the platform. So I tried to read their body language and thought maybe I should just stay right where I was. Something was going on. Didn't know what it was, but it seemed pretty personal, so I just let them be. I found out later this pastor who had grown up in Berlin had been through that station many times on the train. But every time he had gone through, the platform was filled with East German soldiers with their machine guns. It was the first time in his life he had stood on that platform. Surprisingly sacred moment in his life. Diana Butler Bass wrote recently about a surprisingly sacred experience that she had, an experience that I think most of us can relate to. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read what she wrote about it. I think it's time. My voice wavered as I said those words to my husband over the phone. I was home alone when Rowan, our beloved dog, stopped breathing. I had been sitting with him, stroking his warm body. He'd had some particularly difficult days in a long autumn of increasingly hard days. We worried that he was coming to the end of his life, but we didn't know when or what might take him. He'd been so tough and brave in recent weeks, fighting through dementia and other ailments with a tenacious determination to stay with his people. He was growing tired. As I touched him, he drew a breath, and then he didn't for several moments. After what seemed forever, his chest moved again, slowly, softly, faintly. Then it happened a second and a third time. My heart caught in my throat. The time had come. I just knew it. We took him to the vet the next day for that gentle end. In her office, on a rug laid on the floor for this sad purpose, we surrounded him and held him. The last thing he did was cover my face with dog kisses, looking at me with his almost always sparkling dark eyes, and then sleep and silence. As I touched his still body, I knew he'd reached his end. It was, at the same moment, a thundering loss and a tender completion. It was the both and of love, where grief and some inexplicable grace commingle. As we remember the story of the birth of Jesus, the story of the second incarnation of God, may we be open to the surprisingly sacred happening all around us as the first incarnation continues. Amen.